Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Hamry at CSIS, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a continuation of a series of conferences, seminars that we've been hosting concerning a tragedy on our doorstep, and it's the tragedy of Venezuela. The world is so preoccupied with so many issues, but we can't let this tragedy slip past us. We've not seen anything of this scale before. The human suffering that is underway in Venezuela, now been for many years, is just would in any other context stand out as a global crisis, but it lacks the attention that it needs. I especially want to say thank you for this to the government of Canada for making possible this focus. Canada takes this very seriously, and I'm so grateful that Ambassador Guibard is with us today and will be part of the panel that we'll have shortly. My role here today is I want to get out of the way quickly because I want you all to hear from State Secretary Auden Halvorsen. I've had the privilege of knowing State Secretary Halvorsen for very many years. He's held up a lot better than I have, and I'm really grateful that he has joined us today. Norway, in its quiet and very steady way, has been a champion for trying to find solutions at this point for a problem that's become so vexing that many countries have walked away, but Norway hasn't. So, State Secretary, thank you for joining us. Let me turn to you because I think your thoughts here will get this program started in a very serious way, and then we'll turn to Moises to lead the panel discussion after you're done. Thank you very much for joining us today, State Secretary.
Thank you, Dr. Hamra, and dear John, thank you for your kind words of introduction. And distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all of you. So first of all, let me say that I'm very happy to be back and speaking at the CSIS event, even though this one is from my own living room in Oslo. But on today's event, just let me say that very true to its reputation and its standing, I would say that the CSIS has set itself an ambitious goal for today's discussion in outlining a roadmap for successful negotiations in Venezuela. And I am certain that you are up to the task, and I look forward to the discussion. And also let me congratulate you and the authors with the new policy brief, which I read with great interest. I think it contains interesting and relevant analysis and recommendations. And of course, as Dr. Hamra says, the subject is very, very timely, given the grave crisis facing Venezuela and its people today. So I am not going to attempt to outline what the roadmap for successful negotiations may look like. My perspective will be a bit broader, and in a sense, I guess, a bit more theoretical. So what I would like to do is to share with you some of Norway's experiences and perspectives on international conflict resolution, on mediation and facilitation in general. And hopefully that may provide a relevant backdrop for your more in-depth and concrete discussion following this. So in September this year, it will be 28 years since the Oslo Accords between the Israelis and the Palestinians were signed in Washington, D.C. And that was an event, and I would say a process that in many ways marked the beginning of Norway's peace and reconciliation efforts in its current form. And since then, Norwegian diplomats, partner institutions have facilitated various peace processes in different parts of the world. Some of these are well known, including Guatemala, Colombia, Venezuela, Sudan, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, and Afghanistan. Some are more quiet, so to say. And admittedly, these processes have had varying outcomes or are even without resolution as of yet. But through our efforts over the years, I think this work has become something of a hallmark of Norwegian diplomacy. And behind this work, there is an idea that investing in peace, stability, and conflict resolution is worth the effort, and it is the safest, most effective way to ensure stable and prosperous societies and political development. So in this work, I think there is something that you can call an idealistic component, or at least a humanitarian component, a wish to save lives, to relieve suffering, to ensure human dignity, and to end conflict. But this form of diplomacy also makes sense from a more realistic perspective. And if such efforts can in any way contribute to resolving conflicts in other parts of the world, it may well have tangible benefits for our own security and for our own stability, for our allies, for our partners, or to avoid broader spillover of national or regional tensions and conflicts. We also see that such engagement provides access, contacts, networks, information, the staples of classical diplomacy, so to say, and are highly relevant also in a broader context. So over the last 25 years, something has evolved, which is perhaps not a Norwegian model per se, but at least a set of some core principles that inform and guide our work for peace and reconciliation in various contexts. And I will take you through these points. The first, and I think a key one, is confidence building and discretion. We find it crucial to know the key stakeholders in a conflict, to build their trust, to understand their interests. And that can only be done by talking with the conflict actors themselves. We also aim to operate with a low profile in our work. In peace diplomacy, we see that discretion is usually better than public negotiations. It helps build confidence. It reduces political risks for everybody involved, making it easier to deal with complicated and controversial issues, rather than playing them out on a big stage. The second is impartiality. And Norway will never be neutral as such. We need to maintain some key values at the core of our work, such as respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. But still, we strive to be as impartial as possible to gain and to keep the confidence of the parties. The third point is ownership and inclusion. The parties themselves need to feel that they own and are in charge of the processes throughout the process. Peace ultimately depends on them. And we always encourage the parties to include women in their delegations and to find ways of strengthening the legitimacy and sustainability of the processes. Research shows that peace processes where women participate in a real and meaningful way have a better chance of sustainable success. The fourth is acceptance of political risk. Norway recognizes the high political risk of getting involved in peace processes. We accept that not all such processes, not all such engagement may succeed, as experience also has showed us. Fifth is strategic patience. Norway emphasizes long-term engagement, predictability in our approach and in our commitment, and the parties can trust that we are in it for the long run. The sixth is comprehensive engagement. Norway's support, if we sort of take on the job, is not limited to negotiations and the negotiation phase only. It will also extend to implementation of any peace agreement. And seventh, I would say resources and expertise. Norway commits substantial human and financial resources to peace and conflict resolution. It is a major section in our ministry. And this is possible also in Norway due to broad political support in the Norwegian parliament and something that provides continuity in our work across varying governments. And as you know, some of these processes they take a lot of time and have been going on for quite a long time. So as for Venezuela, I will not go into any detail, and I will limit myself to say that it is crucial to find a peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable solution to the crisis, and that the solution must be found and agreed on by the Venezuelans themselves. So to conclude, we know from experience that every avenue to peace requires hard work, it requires patience, and more than anything, it will in the end depend on the political actors themselves. So I wish to thank the CSIS for inviting me to open this seminar, and I look forward to following the discussions going forward. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, State Secretary Halvorsen. As you all know, Norway has been a key mediator and unbiased negotiation facilitator in the past few years. So the last formal negotiation process was one of the most well-structured, and I've seen with my own eyes how Norway's leadership inspires confidence from Venezuelan citizens and political actors across the spectrum. So I appreciate your comments, State Secretary Halvorsen, and you're welcome to watch the stream that follows. As my name is Moises Rendon. I'm the Senior Associate at the Americas Program and former Director of the Future of Venezuela Initiative at CSIS. I have the honor to moderate today's discussion. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this event was made possible through generous funding from the Canada Fund for Local Initiative. CSIS is extremely grateful to Canada for making this event happening. In today's event, we'll discuss a CSIS report that just got published this week. And the title is Lessons for Negotiations in Venezuela, a Roadmap. As the political and social conditions inside Venezuela continue to deteriorate with an unprecedented impact in the region, a mediated negotiation remains one of the only viable solutions to the crisis. That being said, negotiations have been tried many times before. With all negotiations attempts since former President Hugo Chavez came into power in 1999, failed to facilitate national reconciliation. This is why over the last 6 months, the Future of Venezuela Initiative of the Americas Program completed an in-depth study of the current status of negotiations in Venezuela with a particular focus on lessons learned from previous dialogue efforts, both in country and abroad. And the main goal of the report is not to promote a negotiation process itself, but rather raise understanding of the key challenges and the key opportunities that negotiations will face in the future. This is why the report also outlines actionable recommendations to ensure that a future negotiation process is more serious, more successful, and long-lasting. So I encourage you all to read the report, which is now available in English only, but will be available in Spanish very soon. With that being said, and before we kick off the expert panel, I would like to turn to Ambassador Paul Guibard. Paul is the director of Venezuela's task force at Global Affairs Canada. Among other roles in the Canadian government, Mr. Guibard has served Canadian missions abroad, including in Costa Rica, in Cuba, as head of the political economic section. He was also ambassador to Canada, to the Canadian ambassador to Venezuela between 2010 and 2013, and most recently, Rome, as head of the political, economic, public affairs, and advocacy sections in Rome, in Italy. He has also worked in Mexico as foreign minister as part of the exchange program with Canada. Paul, I want to thank you again personally and from CSIS for being here. It's great being working with you in the last few months. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Moises. I just have 3 very quick points. And the first is thanks. A huge thanks to CSIS for the hard work that you've done over a number of months now to pull this whole process together and the report itself. Big thanks to all the participants in that process, the speakers, the moderators, the folks that have commented and so forth. Just my first message is thank you. The second is just to stress again why this issue matters. It doesn't just matter to the 30 million or so Venezuelans in Venezuela. It also matters because it's having a huge impact in the region. We're now looking at the 2nd largest displacement crisis in the world, and it's en route to being the largest displacement crisis in the world. So it's having a huge impact in the region. Final point is just to come back to a few of the recommendations that really struck a chord for me, and that in recent days, we've seen some really interesting developments in Venezuela and on Venezuela. And the first is the crucial importance of cohesion within the opposition. Some really interesting things happening there. The second is the critical importance as well of coordination among the international community. And I think that I hope and I think that this process here can contribute to that. And the third, and picking up a comment by State Secretary Halverson, the really important role of women. And I think that we're also seeing some really interesting developments on the ground in Venezuela on this one as well. So with that, once again, a great big thanks to you and to CSIS for this.
Thank you, Ambassador Gibbard. Okay, now we're gonna start our expert panel. I have given our panelists a couple of key questions to begin with. We will engage, they will have about 5 minutes or so to kind of put those questions into context. Then we will engage in a moderated discussion. And then in the last 10 to 15 minutes or so, we will open the discussion to questions from the audience. So I will invite you all to submit your questions as soon as you have them, and my team will direct those questions to me directly. First, we will hear from Magali Sanchez. Magali is a senior researcher and visiting scholar at the Office of Population Research at Princeton University. As a Venezuelan academic, her work centers around the experiences of Latin America migrants in the US, and she particularly follows the needs and concerns of Venezuelans affected by the country's current crisis. I understand she's going to Colombia very soon, and she's a Fulbright scholar in the next couple of years. Magali, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours now.
Thank you, Moises. I want to start thanking the Center for CSIS and Moises for the invitation to participate in this panel. I recognize the excellent diagnostic and evaluation of present negotiation that is contained in the report that we have been reading and evaluating, as well as the global recommendations and roadmap for upcoming negotiation. I would just to add some consideration of ideas in the following sense. It is extremely important to consider the woman, as we already say in several with the present participants, in terms of active participation, but also decision. But I would add not only by the opposition actors, but also in mediators and facilitators, as well as in stakeholders. The second idea that I would like to accentuate is recognizing the asymmetric relations of powers. The parts are not in similar positions, since in one side there is an autocratic regime with serious consequences in Venezuela and Venezuelans, and in the other side, the opposition fighting for democracy with the classic idea of democracy representations under democratic institutions. So I would say, in short, the crisis of Venezuela right now synthesizes a worldwide process between democracy and autocratic regime tendency. This is a very important element to justify the presence of international actors, as well as United States, European Union, Canada, Russia, China, Turkey, Cuba. Aiming to establish a fair negotiation seems to me essential to balance these power asymmetries, perhaps showing implications of crisis complexity or the root of the crisis, and positioning that can't be dignity negotiation process if one of the parts denied the root of the crisis. The crisis is not only a political crisis, it is more complex society crisis with massive exit of population and enormous repercussions in the region, but also, not also outside the country, but also inside the country, has depopulation happen and transformation in demographics. The other elements that I will consider is trying to combine domestic and international pressure in the following sense, perhaps proposing themes that could go further. The political game of power elections and representations will allow some kind of unification before going to negotiations. Find unity in topics that are priority for the life of most Venezuelans, but also for humankind and planet. For example, it's extremely important to stop the ecocide resulting from the chaos and progressive destructions and mining in the Arco Minero and areas around the Arco Minero with serious repercussions in terms of water contamination by mercury and destruction of the ecosystem rivers. Sensibilization of this thing not only by the parts, but also by mediators, facilitators, and third international actors. The exploitation of the Arco Minero and repercussions in terms of global climate change, it is so important in terms of sensibilization about the problem in Venezuela. Responsibility and implications, not only inside the country, where water resources relate with electricity power production, for example, or water distribution, but also in terms of regional and worldwide ecological and global climate implications. Any transformation of this nature has strong implications in terms of global climate change. Also, in terms of control of the territory by armed groups that are protecting exploitation of minerals by local, primary, or international actors with serious consequence in the local population, but also in terms of global insecurity. The ecocide in Venezuela is the maximum representation of a political crisis and a global ecological crisis with worldwide implications and repercussions. This is a very sensitive topic in the global agenda of the world vis-a-vis the planet ecological policy and driver agreement for the planet, which is a topic, a very sensitive topic, where all countries in the world are agreeing right now. And then finally, I would just remark from the big to partial agreements that any elections or any possibility of referendum, we should keep in mind the importance of national identity documents for Venezuelan. As Venezuelan all around the world and inside knows, the crisis also attained the basic right for identity papers, not only at the national level, but also on international level for passport. The identity documents are basic elements of Venezuelan citizenship inside and outside the country. I will stop there and I will leave a space for discussion later on. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Magali, thank you. Okay, now next we're gonna hear from Ambassador Serio Jaramillo. He served as High Commissioner for Peace for President Juan Manuel Santos in Colombia, and after that he served as Colombian ambassador to Belgium and the EU between 2017 and 2018. Prior to these positions, Ambassador Jaramillo also served as Vice Minister of Defense for Policy and International Affairs. He's currently a senior advisor at the European Institute of Peace. Ambassador, same questions to you, to Magali, and to Juan, who is going to speak after. Two questions. What are the minimum conditions that needs to be in place to ensure the future negotiations are more serious, more successful, and long-lasting? And the second question, are any topics or elements of negotiations that either were not included or only minimally included in our report that should be expanded upon to? So over to you, Ambassador. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Moises, for that introduction, and I'll do my best to answer your questions in 5 minutes. But I do want to join first John Hammer and Paul Gibbard in the calling attention to the humanitarian catastrophe that continues every day in Venezuela. And I congratulate CSIS and the Canadian government for making sure that we don't forget this and we keep working at it. And I do want to say that despite the appearances, in my opinion, progress is actually possible, and some of it has already happened. To answer your question, I would almost return it to you, Moises, because I think you did a great report, and I like very much the fact that you started by going back to basics and asking the basic questions. So I will give some very quick answers to those basic questions we can discuss later. And I will do it, as I see also in the report, in a spirit of what I would call realism. So the first question is, what are you actually going to negotiate? Or as you rightly say, what for? And so far, the standard answer is you're going to negotiate elections. But I have myself found that an unsatisfactory answer, because an election is like a coin toss. It produces winners and losers. And the losers are always going to ask themselves, what is going to happen with us? And if the losers are those people who today are in government, then you cannot just think about elections. You need to think about guarantees. Any transition is about negotiating a series of guarantees, be them political guarantees, legal guarantees, judicial guarantees, or socioeconomic guarantees. So that's the first point. The what is not an event. The what is a process. And the other thing I would say about the what is that what you can actually do has been changing over time from 2000 and early 2019, where it might have been possible to do a comprehensive negotiation to look at everything, to where we are today, which basically the path is of a steep downward slope in terms of the correlation of forces, so that dear friends in the opposition cannot hope today to negotiate the way they would have done 2 years ago. It's no longer possible. You have to look for the realistic path, because the government has no incentives to do today the kind of negotiation it may have done 2 years ago. And so you have to start by very kind of having a hard, cold look at what is actually possible. I've been myself advising the Afghan Republican government and negotiating with the Taliban. And you can come up with brilliant ideas about how to negotiate, but if the other side doesn't want to negotiate, then you're not going to get anywhere. So that brings me to the second point, which is the how. How are you going to negotiate? And I actually frankly think that today the only realistic answer to this question is incrementally. You have to do this by phases. You have to burn one phase and then go to the next. And actually, this has already happened. There was a secret negotiation around the Electoral Council, the CNE, that turned out better than anticipated. And they now have, within what is far from being a perfect reality, they have probably the best CNE they've had since the Chavistas got to power more than 20 years ago. The next phase has to be the regional elections, which are going to happen, as you all know, in November. And this is very important because you cannot talk about elections again in the abstract. Elections are about winning. And if you want to win, you have to have a political apparatus on the ground. You have to have a party mobilizing people. And one of the reasons, apparently, why negotiations are now back in fashion is because the parties themselves on the ground in Venezuela are telling their leaders, including those abroad, look, we need to participate. We cannot actually stay out of politics, otherwise we're dead. So the next objective is credible conditions for the regional elections. And on that, we can then go to the next phase, the big phase of what would presidential elections look like and what guarantees are needed. The question there on the how is also how much of this should be public, how much of this should be done first privately. And if you see what's happening in the last few days, with both Maduro and Guaido publicly referring to the negotiations and publicly stating conditions, that doesn't sound like a good way to start. As soon as microphones take over, you can be sure that things are not going to work. So I think we want to keep a kind of rather quiet approach as has been happening so far. Very quickly, when should you negotiate? You wisely say in your report, one must be careful not to negotiate prematurely under the wrong conditions. I just said that the public signs from both sides don't seem conducive to a big negotiation. So I think in the immediate future, we should observe a principle of do no harm and try to preserve what has been achieved and continue to build on this. And as I said, think about phasing things, because if you phase things, then you give the opportunity to both sides. This is what happened to us in the case of our own negotiation with the FARC by doing 6 months of secret talks. You test the other side. It's not simply confidence building measures. It's trying to see whether you can jointly build a result. And the more results you achieve jointly, the more trust you build. So you have actually more of a floor to move to the next level and to do something more ambitious. So I am not convinced that it's now the time to move into a fully fledged, comprehensive negotiation. And finally, the question you asked, by whom? Who should negotiate this? Well, the first point I would make is that it is imperative to continue to create incentives so that moderates from both sides are empowered and the radicals on both sides don't have as much control as they have sometimes had till now. We certainly wish what is known as the opposition to be as united as possible, but I will say bluntly that I don't think the unity of the opposition is an end in itself. I don't think in any case it's more important than achieving a transition in Venezuela, and that we should make sure that there are incentives on the table so that all the willing move forward, hopefully all of them. 2 words just to finish on the by whom. There is the oft-discussed question of the international community with our Canadian friends. We have been from Brussels working jointly with the Europeans to try and build what we call the second floor of coordination. But I don't think the international community should be the main actors in this. As you say, Moises, it should be the Venezuelans. If we actually make the international community too important, we might actually make things even more difficult. What are important might be 2 things. 1, coordination with the US, which did not happen in 2019, to make sure that the opposition actually has the right cards to put on the table. And secondly, a much stronger regional envelope that has been the case till now. The region taking charge of this. That would actually make things easier. It did in Colombia. And finally, one more bit of good news in my view out of Venezuela, which is this empowerment of civil society, the appearance of Foro Cívico as an independent voice, which I think should be strongly supported. And the more we have those voices, the more we have civil society, all kinds of groups, including women's associations have been referred to, the better our chances at achieving success at some stage. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Ambassador. Those were great. I'm sure we're gonna dive deeper into some of these issues that you put up. Juan Cruz, he's the currently senior advisor at CSIS Americas Program and the director of the CSIS Argentina US Strategic Forum. Prior to this role, he served in the US National Security Council as a special assistant to the president and senior director for Western Hemisphere's Affairs. Mr. Cruz retired from the US government in 2019 after serving more than 30 years. Juan, thank you for joining us. You've been incredible, helpful throughout the first day that we started this project, and I appreciate all your help. Same 2 questions. What are the minimum conditions, Juan, that needs to be in place for a future, more serious process? And you help us, you reviewed this draft report before, but what any other elements that maybe Sergio and Magali has mentioned should be highlighted from this report? Thank you again.
Excellent. Thank you, Moises. And first of all, congratulations to you, your team, and CSIS for an exceptional execution on the study. I know a lot went into this. This is a product of multiple events, a lot of interviews, and is very meaty. And more importantly, I look at it, and I want to use some of my comments. I'm going to cheat because I'm going to think of all the material that was left on the cutting room floor. After you did this report, you have more than 3 times the material left out of the report. So maybe I'll use that to start my commentary, which I'll start with the topic of what did I think we don't see enough of or not at all. And I will say the report does an exceptional job, but let's be frank, there's a limit to what you can put on paper and keep it tight. The first one, I'm in no special order, is an observation on and suggestion on the opposition being better prepared for its engagements, its past negotiations. And I guess I would just ask a simple question: what does this mean? What does it mean to be better prepared? And it's not that I disagree with the question or the suggestion rather, but is it as simple as meet beforehand? Is it a lot more complex than that? Is it that we're suggesting that there'll be coordinated talking points, some choreography, who goes first and who goes second, some anticipation of the moves of the regime, and so that you're prepared to be able to intercept those? Is it red lines, issues that you refuse to discuss and are inappropriate? Or what if scenarios? What if this happens? And of course, what if you have to stand up from the table and walk away? Is that what we're talking about? Or are we talking about even something more complex where you do an A team and a B team? So you have a mock negotiations or people playing the role of regime folk, and you use the examples of what they've used in the past? I don't know. But my purpose is to ask is that, it might have been more helpful if there were more space you could have covered and given concrete suggestions on that specific topic. I also thought it would have been helpful on issues of breakthrough. Not everything has to be bad news. And so if you have a special breakthrough on a vexing problem in the negotiation, it doesn't have to, I mean, I know we talked about, 10 weeks of stalemate in talks in the Paris peace talks that ended the Vietnam War over the shape of the table, 10 weeks. So it's not insignificant and it's not petty, but we should study how did the breakthroughs come about, who provided the breakthroughs, and how important it was. I know that Serio could probably, write another PhD dissertation on the issue of vexing issues and coming out with a breakthrough. And by the way, at what point is a breakthrough a cause for a collapse and walking away from negotiation? So that's important to consider. And of course, what Serio already mentioned, which is the issue of secret processes and pre-talks, subjects that were covered in the report, but only in passing. And in a lot of the peace processes that were discussed on the sidelines and in workshops and in interviews, we know that secret talks or pre-talks became infinitely more important and dealt with the tough issues, so that when you finally have both sides sitting across the table openly from each other, a lot of the tough issues had been ironed out, and everybody knew what it was that they were going to discuss. So I really would underscore that could have been an area where there could have been more meat on the bone. And the last point I would make in this area is the issue of timing and timelines. But again, both mentioned in the report, but you look at something like timing, is it now and is now appropriate? I couldn't agree more with Sergio that we have to go back to, I think the report called it, the conditions are not right. Oftentimes the failure of a talk was the conditions simply weren't right. And there was a lot of desire, a wish to make it work. And all it did was put a lot of disappoint everyone when it collapsed. And I think we're dangerously close to a situation like that today, given that we're trying to crystal ball what the regime is saying and doing. People insisting that so-called signs from the regime, in my own view, are not signs at all, but more coincidences. And that the only sign that really exists is on Citgo, which is a self-created crisis so that you can give up something for free with no price to pay. So there's a tremendous danger in the issue of timing and being too enthusiastic. Even the president's Maduro's declarations yesterday, which were highly insulting, go to another part of the report, which is respect each other. And there have been oftentimes in past negotiations between the two parties where there has been less than respect and name calling and that sort. How can you expect to sit across from each other if you can't even respect each other? So I think some of that can be addressed. I think Sergio gave us a clue to that through secret talks, and it's not just about confidence building, but that's critical in this case. And timelines, we need to be realistic. And even though you address timelines, people I don't think have come psychologically to grips with the fact that timelines can be, and Sergio's given us a little optic on this, can take a long time. A long time. Look at all the examples we studied of successful negotiations, many of which we didn't even put into the report, and 10 years, 7 years, 3 years. The US Cuba secret talks that led to the normalization during Obama administration, almost 3 years. So if you suggest something to the players today, I don't think they would believe you. I think everyone would say, oh, it's a matter of months, weeks, months. The fact is, if you look at the study and all of the examples of successful negotiations, none of those involve weeks and months. None of those. So minimal conditions, I think we need to be very aware of the timelines. Confidence building measures and the latest gestures I would call into question. The issue of respect, I've already noted. We need to stop the infantile name calling. It's just not promising when Maduro calls Guaido names. That's just not, it doesn't foster conditions for good conversation. And lastly, and I couldn't agree more with Sergio on this point, the rough commonality of why we're sitting down. And I think that's absent today. If you ask one party why they would come to the table and the other party why they're coming, there's dissonance on that subject. And so if you can't agree what you're going to talk about, how do you think you're going to be successful? So for me, minimal conditions are you need to want to be at the table. I sense some lukewarm feelings in both parties, and you got to be wanting to talk about the same subject. So I've gone on a little bit, but the material is so rich that I couldn't help but address some of those issues. So thank you, Moises.
Welcome. Thank you, Juan. And on that note, there's a lot of issues and gaps that needs to be explored in a deeper level on this issue of negotiation in Venezuela. So the report goal is not to answer all the questions, but rather kind of shed light of what of those top issues. And one of the top issues that I want to bring Magali into the table again is something that every single one in this event has mentioned, and the report also strongly supports this idea of the inclusion of women in negotiations as a key improvement that must be made for any future dialogue process. There are various reasons why we need to think on that direction. First is that women are disproportionately affected by the humanitarian crisis, so they can ensure the gender sensitivity into the agenda. Another reason that I think Norway mentioned is that data shows that previous experiences that other countries have demonstrated that when they have women in the table, the outcome is always lasts longer and is more successful. And lastly, and this is something the report also highlights, in 20 years of failed negotiations, non-women has been present in the negotiation in the opposition delegation. There may be an exception in 2005 that we look into, but really no women were representing any opposition delegation. So this needs to be, so that's why, Magali, I want to ask you, what do you think about this issue? And what do you think of the inclusion of women will remain a challenge moving forward? Based on your experience, what steps can be taken to enable women's contribution to a future negotiation?
Thank you, Moises. Yes, as I mentioned before, I mean, I think it's so important, the woman presence, but not only in terms of participation, but also the proposals. I think we have capacity, or it's so important, to make associations in between global topics and trying to find a way to mediate what are those conflict topics. In this sense, when, for example, we refer in the, and I want to accentuate again, the report that I read is a very impressive report and covers several topics, and I learn a lot in terms of negotiation history and roadmap and recommendations. Say that, as you can see, I mean, when I was referring to my contributions, or the part that I consider really important to consider, are topics that go further or go ahead or super in terms of find link and association that can go more far away and searching for unified parts. When I refer to asymmetric positions of the two parts, of the parts, if we continue just to stay in the asymmetric positions or in the asymmetric relation, I think it's going to be impossible almost to get something. So one level was referred by Mr. Cruz, and I referred to the fact of dignity and how you arrive to a negotiation with dignity and respect. You have to accept the root of the conflict and the enormous complexity of the conflict. If we arrive just for partial topics and we're trying to negotiate only in this part without making association of the complexity, I think it's going to be rough to get in any part. So associations are important, and not just to stay in the local term of conflict. For conflict resolution, we need global associations. The other thing, and that's is really important. I mean, I know that the two present speakers are expert in the way that negotiation can happen, the structures, the way that different parts are getting in the process, the importance of discretion, et cetera, But also I think it's so important when you imply different parts in the negotiation process, the neutral parts, but also the international actors, to remark the importance of crisis. And in that moment, I accentuate, in that sense, and I accentuate the importance of crisis, political crisis, but also always relate with other crises. Otherwise, we're going to stay just into part of the power, political power. And I think the implications will sensibilize better, not only the international community, but also the local actors in the way that we need to process something to get the right conditions and the mature conditions to get in the negotiations. So I think the participation of women is important because we have that kind of ability of associate things that perhaps look like conflict, but we can see more associations in the way to get to some kind of resolutions. I'm not sure if that is maybe too abstract, but of course it's a dominant of my discipline, which I'm a sociologist, not a political scientist.
Yeah, thank you, Magali. Yes, sure, that's good enough. I invite Serio who want to comment on this issue if you wanted to, but I have another question, Sergio, to put on your plate too. And you know, I can't move on without asking you this, because you were, you know, you held a very important position or opportunity to make Colombia move forward. You know, after 52 years of conflict, Colombia were able to sign a peace agreement with the FARC, and you play a very important role in that process. No, and I know Venezuela is not the same thing. We're talking about maybe two different animals, and I get that. But at the end of the day, we're dealing with elements that maybe we can pull out of your experience in Colombia. And the element that I want to ask you is the nature of the role of criminal actors, organized crime, and armed groups that you know are operating in Venezuela, and they have a huge influence on the institutions and the decision making of politics. So I want to ask you, based on your previous involvement again in the peace process with armed groups, what are the key transferable lessons learned that our audience should be taking into account when evaluating any future negotiation in Venezuela? Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Moises. If I understood correctly, I think there are kind of two questions in what you're saying. So first is this, I will refer to exactly what Juan was saying, at least from our experience, of the importance, because negotiations are not about sitting down and talking to somebody. You can talk to whoever you like, but they're about actually establishing a framework and an objective that is realistic and that is shared by both, and that we try to sort of work through to reach. So I would insist exactly on what Juan said from our own experience, and Juan, by the way, was not just a silent witness, but a very helpful one, of the importance of first trying to agree to some basic things in private, because that's where what is similar. I mean, obviously the situation of Venezuela and Colombia could not be more different, but some elements of negotiations are similar, such as how do you know that the other side is serious? And the other side has the same question about you. So the more the whole thing turns into a public show of public statements, the less either side will believe that the other side is serious. The more you actually get through certain stages and steps where both sides behave in accordance to what they agreed they would do, the more you say, okay, perhaps there is something here. Perhaps we can build on this. So I think that is the way forward in Venezuela, and some things have happened. I don't want to exaggerate their importance, but some things have happened to give one confidence that it is possible to move forward in that direction. Now, you also mentioned this issue of the armed groups and criminal organizations in Venezuela, which have a long history. Venezuela has been a sanctuary for Colombian guerrillas and drug traffickers and others for a long time. But now the situation seems qualitatively different, and you're right about that, which is another reason why one wants to reach some kind of understanding in Venezuela, because it, especially in the border with Colombia, it just grows more and more anarchical. And the kind of things we've seen over the last 6 months, such as major operations of the Venezuelan military against one of the Colombian groups that are fighting each other near the Colombian border, is something that should give everybody pause and get them to think, including CSIS with all your experts on security, because before you know it, you could actually find yourself with the kind of incidents that you thought were not possible in the Americas. So you're right. I mean, we need to keep an eye on these groups, and this is the reason why you need a solution in Venezuela sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Ambassador Juan. I know you have studied this sector. You know, you're a security expert, and you've been involved in many of these areas before. Anything you want to add into the question of how challengeable will be the presence of insecurity, armed groups, organized crime, and how that can affect a future negotiation process?
Thank you, Moises. I'd like to start by maybe taking a bite on this issue of gender representation, because I think I'm glad that it's in the report. It's overdue, and I like the fact that it's generally subscribed to. But it also falls into the wider issue of inclusion, and so it's not just the importance of gender, but the inclusion of people of different affiliations and ideologies, and that we haven't perhaps represented well in the negotiations and the teams making up the negotiating team. And also, I'll remind everyone the issue of the military. When is it that one of the largest power brokers in the country, and perhaps the most important one, is included in these talks? They have their own interests in mind, and it goes back to Serio's point about guarantees. That's a really interesting point. Maybe they don't have to participate in the beginning, but somewhere in the process, it's worth including. I thought that falls in the same category. I also do want to point out and applaud the fact that there's input in your study from other points of view that we haven't usually seen in Washington, and that includes people who were affiliated with the regime and Chavismo, people who were in opposition to the United States and the traditional Venezuelan opposition, and lastly, non-traditional opposition members. And what I mean by that is other people who are in opposition to the regime but aren't part of the quote-unquote opposition. So I think that enriches the paper. And as far as the question relative to the security services, to the various illegally armed groups in the country, what I would say is I can see that during a pre-talks being one of those topics that you frame for the discussion of the negotiations, right? It would be naive of us not to include it in the talks, and it might not be discussed the first or second day, but it will certainly make its way into the agenda, and it has to. Because as we've just seen on armed activity in Apure, the situation has gotten out of the hands of the regime.
Thank you, Juan. You know, Magali, I want to bring you back again, because one of the things we highlight on the report, I'm talking about the issue of inclusion and welcoming other actors, is the role of Chavismo dissidents. No? As many of you know, watching this event, there's a growing group of Venezuelans who were believers of Hugo Chavez and, you know, his ideology of socialism of 21st century and many of the elements that entails. But now they have grown disillusion. Now, among the deeper the humanitarian crisis gets, the economic crisis gets, and the Maduro regimes seems more responsible about those issues, the more this group grows. No? And now today, I feel confident saying that they are a very important group of Venezuelan citizens. And we call them Venezuelan Chavista dissidents, but again, the academics have different phrasing. but Magali, I think one of the things we said, negotiations will fail if the opposition's central objective is to eliminate Chavismo altogether. So what do you think the opposition should be focused on in terms of having a more specific, more realistic and attainable strategy to alienate actors within the regime or others who have, who have stopped being loyal to Maduro's in that sense? Any thoughts on that? And I want to get Sergio's thoughts on this, because I know in the Colombian experience, you also have to deal with different political actors, Sergio. So let's get back to you over this. Magali, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I think, I mean, one of the goals, right, of these possible negotiations is always to arrive to a conflict resolution and peaceful exit or process in the future. So I would say we reivindicate for democratic participation and democratic institutionalization. The diversity inclusion is one of the priorities in this strategy. I mean, you cannot go ahead without considering different parts that are also questioning the driving or the conflict situation at the moment in Venezuela. And I want to add something really important to the precedent comments. I think the problem of insecurity and armed groups are so important, those actors, not only in the border with Colombia, but also in the south of Venezuela, border with Brazil and other countries, right? With Brazil, basically, in the whole Amazon, and in the rest of the country in urban areas. So these are actors that are present, and it's important to consider, as Mr. Cruz referred, and also Sergio Jaramillo referred. So yes, so as inclusion, diversity for a process of democratization and conflict resolution. Yes.
Thank you, Magali. Sergio, any thoughts on this? And I also want to throw you the question. I mean, I'm getting a lot of questions here on my end, and Maduro, as you saw last night, just publicly said that his conditions to have a new negotiation process. No, and you said on your remarks, when things go public, when Maduro, for example, says publicly his conditions, that only can backfire, no, and it's not productive. So just to make sure that everybody's following, the Maduro specifically said he wants 3 conditions to have it for a future process. 1 is to lift all sanctions. 2, recognition of all the institutions. I assuming this is the National Assembly, which got elected in a rigged process in December 2020, and the presidency, which still today many countries recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate president, and Maduro no longer enjoys that legitimacy. So I assume he refers to that. And the third point is that he wants all the bank accounts and assets of the republic back into the Maduro's government control, including PDVSA, the oil company, and the Central Bank of Venezuela. So, back to your point, Ambassador, what is realistic to negotiate today in Venezuela? I know you already said the conditions seem not to be in place to engage in a negotiation process, but where do you see that that line is? Where do you see the conditions will be in place to start kicking off a serious process moving forward? Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Moises. Let me just pick up first on the previous point you made, if I understood it correctly, about the political actors, because I do think that sometimes, even in the context of more classic peace process, such as like our own, it's easy to end up with a slightly technical discussion of the kind we may be having, and forget that negotiations are part of politics, of a larger thing that is called politics, that can be positive or can interfere with the chances of success. And in the case of Venezuela, I think the most important thing for Venezuela actually is to revive democratic politics and to have the problems solved by politicians asking for people's votes, which is why it's extremely important to make sure that the next elections happen, because you cannot pretend to have change in Venezuela and then concede all space and not occupy the political space. On the issue again of the conditions and what Maduro said, it's probably not possible to generalize completely, and there may be circumstances where it is reasonable to demand certain kinds of preconditions, but especially if you are at least doing first a confidential, private, or secret approach. I myself am in favor of having no preconditions and just listening to the other side first and trying to understand, what the hell they're thinking and what can be done, rather than demanding something. And this demands come precisely when it's known and it's public, because once it's public, then you pay a price for being seen to be talking, and that's when people start putting their preconditions on the table. And if you look at Maduro's preconditions, they're obviously designed to make sure that nobody's going to sit at the table. So that's one more argument for staying away from the public show and trying to see whether confidentially you can make a bit more progress first.
Thank you, Ambassador Juan. I'm getting question again here about the U.S. government. You have a U.S. government background, so this question is to you. And I'm gonna put it in two ways. One is by Phil Gonson, the International Crisis Group. He asks, the Biden administration has so far rejected calls to respond with cautious reciprocity to Maduro's limited moves, such as the more balanced CNE, saying concrete steps are needed. Is that a mistake? Phil is asking. And I also want to ask you about the role of the U.S. government moving forward, Juan. As you know, one of the key findings of the report is that the U.S. was missing, including in the Dominican Republic and the Oslo Barbados process. The U.S. was not there, and the regime, as a consequence, the regime did not see the opposition as a relevant or appropriated counterpart, because it knew that the opposition could not deliver on the regime's most frequently requested concession, right? The sanctions relief. So given that the U.S. holds the keys to the most sanctions, right? What do you think the role of the U.S. government should be moving forward in the negotiation process? And let's put it more difficult one, sorry. What would be the role of other allies of the Maduro regime? Russia, China, we have Iran, we have Cuba. In essence, what is the role of the international community in this process? And I also want to get Sergio's and Magali's thoughts on this. I know it's a very difficult question. So Juan, you got about 3 minutes.
Okay, 3 minutes for these 7 questions. Okay, the first one, I very rarely disagree with Serio. He's a good friend of mine, and we've spent many hours. But I would disagree on his opinion on the CNE and the value and the decisions on the CNE. I personally place zero value on the CNE. It doesn't matter if the opposition or people with a inclination for the opposition represents 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 members of the CNE. Ultimately, experience shows that the regime will place pressures outside of 4 walls to ensure that it's compliant with what the government wants done. And so that piece has never impressed me. I know other governments and around the world are trying to find a positive move in that. I see that as maybe a bit of trickery. The U.S. has actually been pretty clear, and so I don't understand how a U.S. move to the so-called signals of the regime is necessary. The U.S. has been painfully clear from the beginning and repeatedly on message, and coming out of the words, the mouth specifically of Juan Gonzalez, the senior director of Western Hemisphere at the NSC, the President Biden's primary advisor on Latin America, who has said the negotiations are between the regime and the opposition. Those are the 2 parties that should be negotiating. Now, and it doesn't get clearer than that. What do you want? We want the 2 parties to negotiate. And Sergio knows all too well that to include the US, because part of your question is about a US role, that include the US doesn't mean you include that it's appropriate to include them at the beginning. In the, I can't speak for Serio, and Serio is probably going to correct me here, but there was some interest by the FARC to have the United States at the negotiating table when the peace talks started, and that's something the U.S. was reluctant to do, and certainly Colombia, the government of Colombia had to look at carefully. It wasn't the right thing to do. The two factions should be the two speaking. But guess what? During the process, at the right time, conditions led to the right spot for the U.S. to have an appropriate role. And so maybe that's a good example of you don't come in at the beginning and impose. When outside individuals should be part of your process, there might be a natural process that leads to that. And Sarah, you please correct me if I've butchered that piece. But you talk about other players, and this is what I would say. The report itself talks about side tables, and we also talked about the issues of guarantors and others who look after the interests of the primary negotiators and maybe sitting in the room but are muted and have an opportunity to coach and to coax in between the actual negotiating sessions. And that's what I would offer with the time I have.
Thank you, Juan. Sergio, let me ask you a similar question to you. And how you will define the role of the international community engagement, maybe from two perspectives. The facilitator's perspective, I mean, as you know, this is not likely going to be resolved without serious facilitators who have had experience meditating other conflicts, and that's why Norway stands out still stands out as a potential facilitator, as Sweden and other countries. Maybe what is the role of multilateral organizations? I mean, the same principle of neutrality applies here. Now, what about the United Nations? Do you see the UN playing any role in this process? And from the geopolitical perspective, I mean, Venezuela is embedded in a broader geopolitical tension, and we have the US, the Lima Group, and on the other hand, we have China, Russia, Cuba. So can Cuba play a constructive role in this process? Can Russia and China do the same? So over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Moises. I think I will first exercise my right of reply to Juan to make sure we don't finish this panel by agreeing on everything and have a little bit of controversy. So on the issue of the CNE, my view is frankly a pragmatic one, which is you have pragmatists and radicals on both sides, and if you insist on the maximalist position, what you are going to end up doing in the end is just conceding all the space to the other side, and in the end you may just have water in your hands, which is basically what has happened over the last few years. And no result is not just not going to be perfect. It's going to be pretty mediocre. But your choice is between pretty mediocre and nothing at the moment. And I myself would go for the pretty mediocre first, and for political participation. But it's a valid debate, and we can have an argument about this. On the issue of the US, what Juan said is absolutely right, except that it was the Colombian government who did not want the US to be directly involved in the negotiations. Actually, Juan was a witness to this, because some of the voices in Washington have said the opposite, but this is not true. We made sure, and Juan was critical in this, that the US government knew everything we were doing. But we also jointly timed the right moment, it was exactly what Juan is saying, for the US to come forward. And the US only came forward halfway through the big public negotiation, when we approached John Kerry, then Secretary of State, and put this on the table, saying we think it's now the right moment. And they were fabulous, and the Obama administration responded very quickly, because they already knew everything was going on. And they were also looking at this very carefully and tracking it and making their own judgment. And so that's how it worked. In the case of Venezuela, we seem to be going from one extreme to the other. In 2019, it was the US was driving the whole thing. Sometimes you think that some of the G4 guys were kind of waiting for Washington to make the decisions that they should be making themselves, which is actually not a good way to proceed. Whereas now, I fully sympathize with what I understand is the current US position, which is we don't want to be taking the first two forward on this. We want to do this jointly with others. And I think that all makes perfect sense. But I do sense that they're being a bit slow in DC about making up their minds about what outcomes seem okay. And so this confuses the whole system. Because in order to do what Juan has described, you do have to have a plan in your head, and you need to start moving. And I don't yet see any movement in Washington myself. I may be wrong, of course, this is just analysis. And on the issue of other countries, I think it's very good to have as much international coordination as possible. As I said at the beginning, I've been trying to help with that myself, modestly from Brussels, along with the EU, European governments, the Canadian, Latin Americans. But I wouldn't want to turn this negotiation into an international negotiation, which is what I was saying at the beginning. I mean, if in order to sort of sort out Venezuela, we need to make sure that the Chinese and the Russians and the Cubans and the US, they all agree, I think we may be putting another layer of complexity on this. I think it's more of a case of key actors letting things happen rather than sort of being on the first row pushing for this. I may again be wrong, but I think that the more it's actually driven by the Venezuelan political process, the better our chances of success.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think you're absolutely right. And again, I don't want to over-advertise the report, but in the report, we had a graphic where it shows very clearly that a central table right in the middle will probably be the table for the Venezuelan themselves to negotiate, facilitated by someone like Norway. But then around the central table, you have the room next door, quote unquote, you have the civil society consultation table, you have the humanitarian relief table, you have the illegal mining that Magali brought up, the human rights and political prisoners. You know, there are many other issues that are very important and deserve immediate attention in Venezuela. But again, in a structure that that makes sense will probably improve the process of negotiating in Venezuela. And that's one of the challenges moving forward, you know, how to integrate all of these demands. Magali, I want to bring you back to the table and ask you, I mean, you've been studying the diaspora, the Venezuelan diaspora, Venezuelan migrants around the globe. And I cannot finish the event without asking you what Ambassador William Brownfield has been pushing for so long. What is the role of the Venezuelan diaspora here? What is the role of the Venezuelan diaspora? There are over 5.6 million people. According to the OEAs, it may go to 7 million people. This is almost 20% of the country's population. So what would be their role in a new negotiation process from your perspective?
Thank you, Moises. Yes, I think the diaspora, as you call, or the immigrants outside the country, Venezuelans, are so important to participate in one way or another. I don't say directly in the table, in the central table, recalling the graphic that is in the report, but I would say that in platforms and relations where you can valorize human capital that exists outside the country. And this human capital and higher skill Venezuelans that are outside the country can not only bring their expertise, but also the relation with the network where they are associated, and create platforms with the highest skill that exists in the country. So that's the diaspora, in my opinion. So it will be very important, perhaps, to incorporate it in the process, in any round tables around, in the tables around, in the next tables around, in this topic that has been referred in the report. I think it's so important. Also, we can see there is organizations by the diaspora in other levels, like enterprise levels, commercial levels, organization of the population, migrant population that are outside without documents, without integration. So you can take advantage of the immigrant population that is, as you mentioned, I would say more than 20% of the population outside. So yes.
Thank you, Magali. Juan, over to you. I do want to bring you the issue of the opposition and importance of unity. And by the way, those watching online, feel free to keep sending your questions. I'm getting some of the questions, but some of those we already touched on. So feel free to shoot your questions along. We only have a few more minutes left. But Juan, Ambassador Gibbard from Canada, and I think at some extent, State Secretary Halvorsen also mentioned it, the importance of unity among the opposition and why the cohesion among these forces is so important. And you've been following the Venezuelan crisis for a good time now. So I guess, I mean, you already touched on some of those, no? But my question would be, do you find like how, you know, we put it in the report spanning the tent, and you mentioned, yes, the military needs to play a role. What about finding new fresh faces in terms of a new strategy? What would be your vision to have a more representative, cohesive, united opposition moving forward? Now, how can we make sure that that force is united? It's a very complex, it's very difficult to unite the opposition forces. So how do you see that happening?
Wow, I'm going to get in trouble. So I guess the first thing I would say is that we should draw from some of the examples that we discussed in different workshops, but didn't make its way to the report. And one really, or didn't make, the details didn't make it to the report. One is Chile, a really good example of unity. Unity doesn't need to mean allegiance. Unity doesn't need to mean you're my new best friend. And unity just means the enemy of my enemy in this case, right? The lowest common denominator. It's this kind of issue where you say, all you have to do is agree that we want democracy to return and they want the regime out. And unity has been elusive, has been difficult, and has been fragile. And oftentimes when unity has been declared, it's been pretty obvious that there is no unity. I would say there's more unity now than there's been in a long, long time. There's been a lot of effort and investment placed on that. It's still imperfect, but it's good enough, right? The other example, I would say that in Chile, had it not been for this unity, big things wouldn't have happened in a place where the dictatorship felt comfortable. And I would like to then draw a parallel also with Brazil, another case that we didn't make its way to the report, but we discussed the transition to democracy from a military government in Brazil. And in that case, it was even more black and white, right? It was the regime and the regime's instilled party against everybody else in the country. Communist, socialist, right-wingers who worked with the government, they all were in one party, one movement first, that had as a sole purpose redemocratization and the return of civilian rule. And then, and so if we could just focus on those things, we could get to the point that you make about negotiations. We don't have to like that they're there, but I would like to see a negotiating table that in some architecture included important businessmen associations, maybe, key members of civil society who are in opposition to the regime but are not formally part of the opposition. Maybe some syndicates, maybe some of the micro parties that are strong in certain parts of the country that have up to date been underrepresented. But I think the table needs to be a lot more representative of Venezuela and the Venezuelan interests that are against the regime. And for too long, it's been represented by 4 parties. And so I think there's got to be a little more equity in that regard. I'm sure that I'm going to hear a lot from, opposition people, but that's my own personal opinion.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you. Appreciate it. And yeah, I agree, and I think we also need unity internationally. No, as you have mentioned yourself, there's no unity among the European Union, the U.S., and other actors. So it applies both ways. Sergio, thank you. I want to start wrapping.
Say something on the unity question.
Go ahead, please.
Very important one. I mean, I think there are two things to be said about unity. The first is exactly what Juan has said, which is, unity of whom? I mean, who's, because actually the guys who've been around doing this so far are just, they just represent, a major part of the political parties, but they don't represent them all, and certainly not all the interests in society. So if you're looking at a transition that is more ambitious, you're going to have to expand. But the other point I would make is that, as I said in my initial remarks, I mean, by all means, the more united the opposition goes into this, the better. But unity, absolute unity in itself, is not an end in itself. The end is actually to achieve the transition. So if you make the unity, absolute unity, an end in itself, what you end up doing is giving veto power to the more radical elements who are going to put a stick in your wheel, which, as has happened. So where you draw the line, yes, that's a valid discussion, and we need the opposition to represent as many people as possible. And that press release the last few days is good news. I was very pleased about that. But we shouldn't make unity kind of the holy grail of what we're trying to achieve here. The holy grail is actually achieving transition in Venezuela.
Thank you, Sergio. That's interesting. Magali, what do you think? I mean, you're Venezuelan, you know the political situation in your country, and what do you think about the importance of unity in the opposition and whether it's achievable in the short term? Over to you.
La pregunta de las 40,000 lochas. I think it's important to agree, and something has been mentioned by the two present experts, which is searching for democracy and instauration in the country. Now it's clear that to get there, I mean, we need to accept and recognize that is, as I mentioned before, but I guess maybe was too strong. I mean, to recognize the crises that exist in Venezuela are extremely complex. Yes, we want democracy. We want stabilization in the countries. That's the crisis. That's the major crisis. We want transition for democratic institutions, but it has been also a progressive instauration of other kind of structure that is not necessarily a democratic institution. So it's a very complex situation there. So yes, unity to achieve whatever we need at the moment and mature in the process, learning through the process, I think is so important, without forgetting where we are, right, in terms of crisis and linking of the crisis. And I insist in that.
Yes, thank you, Magali. Okay, we're gonna start wrapping up, but Sergio, I don't wanna finish the event without asking you the question of transitional justice now and human rights violation. This is something that I know you have been involved with in the past. A ver, you know, the report clearly says the criminal actors, especially those who have been indicted by the US justice system, will not engage credibly in any negotiation process without judicial guarantees and clear transitional justice mechanisms. And you know, I've been following the Venezuelan crisis for a while now, and unfortunately, that's one of the areas that I don't see as developed. I mean, I know we have some organizations have been trying to do here and there, but there's really not a clear pathway of how to get actors that have been committing crimes to justice and how that is integrated in the negotiation process. So I want to ask you, what are the challenges or the opportunities to make a transitional justice process in Venezuela, and what will be your vision on how that will look like?
Well, I mean, that's a really tough one, as you know, and I'll use the standard image of a coin with two faces or two sides. So one is that nobody is going to go into a negotiation to find themselves put immediately in jail. It's what we faced with the FARC. So if all the people who are going to be sitting across from you at the table, as happened to us, have indictments in the US and the prospect of those sort of landing in US prison as soon as they sign some kind of agreement is there, then they're not going to sign that agreement. Now, I think this is a problem that the Venezuelans are going to, from my own experience, the Venezuelans are going to have to find a solution to themselves. I don't think the US is going to do anything about that. So that's kind of the obvious thing. On the other hand, the other side of that coin is that if you actually get a serious negotiation going, then you can achieve surprising things that at the beginning of the negotiation seemed impossible. In our case, I think what happened in Colombia just about 3 weeks ago, the FARC went before a special tribunal and acknowledged or accepted an indictment against them for crimes against humanity, for the crime of kidnapping, and said, yes, we are guilty. Obviously, they will be handed a sentence which is not the usual prison sentence, but they will be handed a sentence which they will have to serve. And this had never happened ever before, that a guerrilla force goes before a tribunal and acknowledges really serious crimes that are crimes against humanity. I was at a private meeting a week ago or 10 days ago, where the prosecutor of the ICC said that, Colombia was an example this actually could be done. And we're going to have army officers doing the same thing for extrajudicial executions. These were completely unthinkable things when we started the negotiation. So those are the two sides. You have to offer guarantees, because otherwise people are not going to go for it. But if you actually push hard and you negotiate things and you structure things adequately, then you may achieve actually much more in terms of justice than people may think at the beginning.
Thank you, Sergio. Juan, Magali, one quick question for you, and then we wrap up. Juan, one of the things we discussed before and is what would be the best location or under what conditions for a future process in Venezuela? As you mentioned, successful negotiation will be preceded by months of confidence building, exploratory talks, agenda setting, among other stuff. So what setting what country, what host do you think should be there? I think we mentioned Mexico, Panama as some of the options, but what do you think? And Magali, we're gonna wrap up with you. And I'm just gonna ask you a general question. What would be your message? I mean, there are many Venezuelans watching this event. So I want you to just, what would be the key message that you want Venezuelans to receive who are frustrated, who knows the negotiation have failed many times before? What would be a message from you, a Venezuelan academic who has been successfully in the US? So over to you, Juan.
Yeah, Moises, there's a reason that the Esquipulas agreement is called Esquipulas, right? A small town on the border between Guatemala and El Salvador. Your choices usually are someplace isolated where you're forced to be to deal with these issues and not get distracted, or be in a large place where you're under a microscope, like Paris. That's a good example. But so in this case, yeah, you talked about some of the countries that, there's probably every country in the hemisphere would like to be the host of something that looked promising, and that could be their important contribution to ending a terrible crisis. But some countries are better positioned than others, logistically and for security and ease of travel, and for their own disposition and attitude towards something like this. And you named, yes, Mexico's always sounds, like the right place for everybody to be able to get there easily or not. And Panama, certainly, I think Panama has historically served that role. Contadora Group, and just as part of their foreign policy to offer this kind of opportunity. And but other than that, I'd be careful with places that are too hard to get to or too parochial, just because the logistics can be tough on this, and we have to look at everything from security to some other things. And I'd also say, and Serio can speak to this a lot better than I can, but in these long processes, it takes its toll, and you need to be able to be in a place where you can exercise or read in peace, so that you're not surrounded by everybody that you have to see every day, eat meals with every day, work with every day. There's a whole psychology to negotiating teams that have to spend hours on end with each other, and then put a single face in front of the other side. So you have to find a place that offers those kinds of things that aren't distractions, but allow, you don't all want to compete for that internet access that doesn't seem to be able to let you stream Netflix. So anyway, that's just some of the minutia, but that's all what I would offer.
Thank you, Juan. Magali, have one more minute. You're muted. Yes.
I will forget about that. I'm sorry. In 1 minute, just thank you for say goodbye in a very optimistic way, I would say. It's not an easy process that it's possible to start, the process of negotiation, searching for the peace and democratic return of Venezuela. But yes, I would ending with a positive position, not only because I would remind academia have a collection and a production, an important capital production in terms of the crisis that Venezuela has been experienced for 20 years already, or depending on the position of yourself, where the crisis start, but it's a high production. And I cannot close my humble contribution here with an optimistic message. Yes, if we don't believe in possible conflict resolution, it will be impossible to continue to be in this place.
Awesome, thank you.
In general.
Yes, thank you, Magali. Thank you very much. Look, I want to, again, thank our panelists. They have been wonderful today. Sergio, Juan, and Magali, thank you so much for sharing your expertise for Venezuela. For all of you watching, again, a reminder, go read the report. I'm sure you're going to find something that may help to envision a new, more successful, more serious, more inclusive process of negotiation. Again, it's available in English. It should be available in Spanish very soon, if not today, tomorrow. But again, go and read the report. That's why we work in the last 6 months on that. And then I agree with Magali. Let's just finish with the positive note here. I think overall, although negotiations have failed before, this failure should not prevent them from being used as a tool to resolve the Venezuelan crisis, no, and learn the lessons learned. And as State Secretary Halvorsen said himself, I mean, we need an inclusive, peaceful, and sustainable solution, and that starts by looking into the past, no, and learn from our past. Again, thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the day and the week, and enjoy the Memorial Day weekend. Well, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.